Oh, hi. I didn't notice it had gone live already. Um, I'm back. It's obviously been way more days than I thought it would be before I got some computer time when my whole family wasn't making a ton of noise in the background. Sorry about that, but I'm doing my best. I'm here with Charles Dickens's Bleak House again. We need to finish chapter 6. And before I get into that, I want to say two things. My first thing that I'm going to say is that my plan was to record every day at a random time and have it be live and then have the recording post at 10 p.m. every day. But obviously that didn't work this week. Uh, Maybe I'll try that again for this coming week and we'll see how it goes. But today I'm going to try to record more than once so that we can do a little bit of catching up. And the other thing I want to say is that there's a character who we meet in these next few pages. And I've read this chapter twice now, and I just can't get comfortable with the sound of this character. And um, I don't know what my problem is, but I can't figure out how to voice this character. So it might suck, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. Um, and that's that. Um, okay, here we go. All right. Uh, Bleak House. Oh, also, the last video stopped streaming way before. Let's adjust my camera there so I can sit back a little better. There we go. The last video stopped streaming way before I realized it had stopped streaming, and that sucked because it cut off like the last two pages that I read. Um, I am going to go back and reread a couple pages. So it's not actually leaving off where I wanted it to leave off. Um, okay. I think where it cut out was when Mr. Jarndyce was describing. Um, he calls him a child, but I think he's more accurately referred to as a simple minded adult, an adult with some kind of developmental disability or developmental delay. Um, and so he's not literally a child, but he's developmentally. Anyway, so I'm going to reread that description of him. Uh, I am glad you like it, said Mr. Jarndyce, when he had brought us round again to Ada's sitting room. It makes no pretensions, but it is a comfortable little place, I hope, and will be more so with such bright young looks in it. You have barely half an hour before dinner. There's no one here but the finest creature upon earth, a child. More children, Esther, said Ada. I don't mean literally a child, pursued Mr. Jarndyce. Not a child in years. He's grown up. He is at least as old as I am. But in simplicity and freshness and enthusiasm, and a fine guileless inaptitude for all worldly affairs, he is a perfect child. We felt that he must be very interesting. He knows Mrs. Jellyby, said Mr. Jarndyce. He is a musical man, an amateur, but might have been a professional. He's an artist too, an amateur, but might have been a professional. He's a man of attainments and of captivating manners. He has been unfortunate in his affairs and unfortunate in his pursuits and unfortunate in his family. But he don't care. He's a child. Did you imply that he has children of his own, sir? Inquired Richard. Yes, Rick, half a dozen, more. Nearer a dozen, I should think, but he has never looked after them. How could he? He wanted somebody to look after him. He is a child, you know, said Mr. Jarndyce. And have the children looked after themselves at all, sir? Inquired Richard. Why, just as you may suppose, said Mr. Jarndyce, his countenance suddenly falling. It is said that the children of the very poor are not brought up but dragged up. Harold Skimpole's children have tumbled up somehow or other. The wind's getting round again, I am afraid. I feel it rather. Richard observed that the situation was exposed on a sharp night. It is exposed, said Mr. Jarndyce. No doubt that's the cause. Bleak House has an exposed sound. But you are coming my way. Come along. Our luggage having arrived and being all at hand, I was dressed in a few minutes, and engaged in putting my worldly goods away when a maid, not the one in attendance upon Ada, but another, whom I'd not seen, brought a basket into my room with 2 bunches of keys in it, all labelled. For you, miss, if you please, said she. For me, said I. The housekeeping keys, miss. I showed my surprise, for she added, with some little surprise on her own part, I was told to bring them as soon as you was alone, miss. Miss Summerson, if I don't deceive myself? Yes, said I, that is my name. The large bunch is the housekeeping, and the little bunch is the cellars, miss. Any time you was pleased to appoint tomorrow morning, I was to show you the presses and things they belong to. I said I would be ready at 6:30, and, after she was gone, stood looking at the basket, quite lost in the magnitude of my trust. Ada found me thus, and had such a delightful confidence in me when I showed her the keys and told her about them, that it would have been insensibility and ingratitude not to feel encouraged. I knew, to be sure, that it was the dear girl's kindness, but I liked to be so pleasantly cheated. When we went downstairs, we were presented to Mr. Skimpole, who was standing before the fire, telling Richard how fond he used to be in his school time of football. He was a little bright creature with a rather large head, but a delicate face and a sweet voice, and there was a perfect charm in him. All he said was so free from effort and spontaneous, and was said with such a captivating gaiety, that it was fascinating to hear him talk. Being of a more slender figure than Mr. Jarndyce, and having a richer complexion, with browner hair, he looked younger. Indeed, he had more the appearance, in all respects, of a damaged young man than a well-preserved elderly one. There was an easy negligence in his manner, and even in his dress, his hair carelessly disposed, and his neckerchief loose and flowing, as I've seen artists paint their own portraits, which I could not separate from the idea of a romantic youth who had undergone some unique process of depreciation. It struck me as being not at all like the manner or appearance of a man who had advanced in life by the usual road of years, cares, and experiences. I gathered from the conversation that Mr. Skimpole had been educated for the medical profession, and had once lived in his professional capacity in the household of a German prince. He told us, however, that as he'd always been a mere child in point of weights and measures, and had never known anything about them, except that they disgusted him, he'd never been able to prescribe with the requisite accuracy of detail. In fact, he said, he had no head for detail, and he told us with great humour that when he was wanted to bleed the prince, or physic any of his people, he was generally found lying on his back in bed reading the newspapers, or making fancy sketches in pencil, and couldn't come. The prince at last objecting to this, in which, said Mr. Skimpole in the frankest manner, he was perfectly right, the engagement terminated, and Mr. Skimpole having, as he added with delightful gaiety, nothing to live upon but love, fell in love, and married, and surrounded himself with rosy cheeks. His good friend Jarndyce and some other of his good friends then helped him in quicker or slower succession to several openings in life, but to no purpose, for he must confess to 2 of the oldest infirmities in the world. One was that he had no idea of time, the other that he had no idea of money. in consequence of which he never kept an appointment, never could transact any business, and never knew the value of anything. Well, so he had got on in life, and here he was. He was very fond of reading the papers, very fond of making fancy sketches with a pencil, very fond of nature, very fond of art. All he asked of society was to let him live. That wasn't much. His wants were few. Give him the papers, conversation, music, mutton, coffee, landscape, fruit in the season, a few sheets of Bristol board, and a little claret, and he asked no more. He was a mere child in the world, but he didn't cry for the moon. He said to the world, "Go your several ways in peace. Wear red coats, blue coats, lawn sleeves. Put pens behind your ears. Wear aprons. Go after glory, holiness, commerce, trade, any object you prefer, only let Harold Skimpole live." All this and a great deal more he told us, not only with the utmost brilliancy and enjoyment, but with a certain vivacious candour, speaking of himself as if he were not at all his own affair, as if Skimpole were a third person, as if he knew that Skimpole had his singularities, but still had his claims too, which were the general business of the community, and must not be slighted. He was quite enchanting. If I felt at all confused at that early time, in endeavouring to reconcile anything he said with anything I'd thought about the duties and accountabilities of life, which I am far from sure of, I was confused by not exactly understanding why he was free of them. That he was free of them I scarcely doubted. He was so very clear about it himself. "I covet nothing," said Mr. Skimpole in the same light way. "Possession is nothing to me. Here's my friend Jarndyce's excellent house. I feel obliged to him for possessing it. I can sketch it and alter it. I can set it to music. When I'm here, I have sufficient possession of it, and have neither trouble, cost, nor responsibility. My steward's name, in short, is Jarndyce, and he can't cheat me. We've been mentioning Mrs. Jellyby. There is a bright-eyed woman of a strong will and immense power of business detail, who throws herself into objects with surprising ardour. I don't regret that I have not a strong will and an immense power of business detail, to throw myself into objects with surprising ardour. I can admire her without envy. I can sympathize with the objects. I can dream of them. I can lie down on the grass in fine weather and float along an African river, embracing all the natives I meet, as sensible of the deep silence and sketching the dense, overhanging tropical growth as accurately as if I were there. I don't know that it's of any direct use, my doing so, but it's all I can do, and I do it thoroughly. Then, for heaven's sake, having Harold Skimpole, a confiding child, petitioning you, the world, an agglomeration of practical people, of business habits, to let him live and admire the human family, do it somehow or other, like good souls, and suffer him to ride his rocking horse." It was plain enough that Mr. Jarndyce had not been neglectful of the adjuration. Mr. Skimpole's general position there would have rendered it so, without the addition of what he presently said. "It's only you, the generous creatures, whom I envy," said Mr. Skimpole, addressing us, his new friends, in an impersonal manner. "I envy you your power of doing what you do. It is what I should revel in myself. I don't feel any vulgar gratitude to you. I almost feel as if you ought to be grateful to me for giving you the opportunity of enjoying the luxury of generosity. I know you like it. For anything I can tell, I may have come into the world expressly for the purpose of increasing your stock of happiness. I may have been born to be a benefactor to you by sometimes giving you an opportunity of assisting me in my little perplexities. Why should I regret my incapacity for details and worldly affairs when it leads to such pleasant consequences? I don't regret it, therefore. Of all his playful speeches, playful yet always fully meaning what they expressed, none seemed to be more to the taste of Mr. Jarndyce than this. I had often new temptations afterwards to wonder whether it was really singular, or only singular to me, that he, who was probably the most grateful of mankind upon the least occasion, should so desire to escape the gratitude of others. We were all enchanted. I felt it a merited tribute to the engaging qualities of Ada and Richard, that Mr. Skimpole, seeing them for the first time, should be so unreserved, and should lay himself out to be so exquisitely agreeable. They, and especially Richard, were naturally pleased for similar reasons, and considered it no common privilege to be so freely confided in by such an attractive man. The more we listened, the more gaily Mr. Skimpole talked, and what with his fine, hilarious manner, and his engaging candour, and his genial way of lightly tossing his own weaknesses about, as if he'd said, I am a child, you know. You are designing people compared with me. He really made me consider myself in that light. But I am gay and innocent. Forget your worldly arts, and play with me. The effect was absolutely dazzling. He was so full of feeling, too, and had such a delicate sentiment for what was beautiful or tender, that he could have won a heart by that alone. In the evening, when I was preparing to make tea, and Ada was touching the piano in the adjoining room and softly humming a tune to her cousin Richard, which they had happened to mention, he came and sat down on the sofa near me, and so spoke of Ada that I almost loved him. She is like the morning, he said, with that golden hair, those blue eyes, and that fresh bloom on her cheek. She is like the summer morning. The birds here will mistake her for it. We will not call such a lovely young creature as that, who is a joy to all mankind, an orphan. She is the child of the universe. Mr. Jarndyce, I found, was standing near us with his hands behind him and an attentive smile upon his face. The universe, he observed, makes rather an indifferent parent, I'm afraid. Oh, I don't know, cried Mr. Skimpole buoyantly. I think I do know, said Mr. Jarndyce. Well, cried Mr. Skimpole, you know the world, which in your sense is the universe, and I know nothing of it, so you shall have your way. But if I had mine, glancing at the cousins, there should be no brambles of sordid realities in such a path as that. It should be strewn with roses. It should lie through bowers where there was no spring, autumn, nor winter, but perpetual summer. Age or change should never wither it. The base word money should never be breathed near it. Mr. Jarndyce patted him on the head with a smile, as if he'd been really a child, and passing a step or two on, and stopping a moment, glanced at the young cousins. His look was thoughtful, but had a benignant expression in it, which I often, how often, saw again, which has long been engraven on my heart. The room in which they were, communicating with that in which he stood, was only lighted by the fire. Ada sat at the piano. Richard stood beside her, bending down. Upon the wall their shadows blended together, surrounded by strange forms, not without a ghostly motion caught from the unsteady fire, though reflecting from motionless objects. Ada touched the notes so softly and sang so low that the wind, sighing away to the distant hills, was as audible as the music. The mystery of the future, and the little clue afforded to it by the voice of the present, seemed expressed in the whole picture. But it is not to recall this fancy well as I remember it, that I recall the scene. First, I was not quite unconscious of the contrast in respect of meaning and intention between the silent look directed that way and the flow of words that had preceded it. Secondly, though Mr. Jarndyce's glance, as he withdrew it, rested for but a moment on me, I felt as if, in that moment, he confided to me, and knew that he confided to me, and that I received the confidence. His hope that Ada and Richard might one day enter on a dearer relationship. Mr. Skimpole could play on the piano and the violoncello, and he was a composer, had composed half an opera once, but got tired of it, and played what he composed with taste. After tea, we had quite a little concert, in which Richard, who was enthralled by Ada's singing, and told me that she seemed to know all the songs that ever were written, and Mr. Jarndyce and I were the audience. After a little while I missed, first Mr. Skimpole, and afterwards Richard, and while I was thinking how could Richard stay away so long and lose so much, the maid who had given me the keys looked in at the door, saying, "If you please, miss, could you spare a minute?" When I was shut out with her in the hall, she said, holding up her hands, "Oh, if you please, miss, Mr. Carson says, would you come upstairs to Mr. Skimpole's room? He's been took, miss." "Took?" said I. "Took, miss, sudden," said the maid. I was apprehensive that his illness might be of a dangerous kind, but of course I begged her to be quiet and not disturb anyone, and collected myself as I followed her quickly upstairs, sufficiently to consider what were the best remedies to be applied if it should prove to be a fit. She threw open a door, and I went into a chamber where, to my unspeakable surprise, instead of finding Mr. Skimpole stretched upon the bed or prostrate on the floor, I found him standing before the fire smiling at Richard, while Richard, with a face of great embarrassment, looked at a person on the sofa in a white greatcoat, with smooth hair upon his head, and not much of it, which he was wiping smoother and making less of with a pocket handkerchief. "Miss Summerson," said Richard hurriedly, "I'm glad you are come. You will be able to advise us. Our friend, Mr. Skimpole, don't be alarmed, is arrested for debt." "And really, my dear Miss Summerson," said Mr. Skimpole, with his agreeable candour, "I never was in a situation in which that excellent sense and quiet habit of method and usefulness, which anybody must observe in you who has the happiness of being a quarter of an hour in your society, was more needed." The person on the sofa, who appeared to have a cold in his head, gave such a very loud snort that he startled me. "Are you arrested for much, sir?" I inquired of Mr. Skimpole. "My dear Miss Summerson," said he, shaking his head pleasantly, "I don't know. Some pounds, odd shillings, and halfpence, I think, were mentioned." "It's £24 16 and sevenpence halfpenny," observed the stranger. "That's what it is." "And somehow it sounds," said Mr. Skimpole, "like a small sum." The strange man said nothing, but made another snort. It was such a powerful one that it seemed quite to lift him out of his seat. "Mr. Skimpole," said Richard to me, "has a delicacy in applying to my cousin Jarndyce, because he has lately— I think, sir, I understood that you had lately—" "Oh, yes," returned Mr. Skimpole, smiling, "though I forgot how much it was and when it was. Jarndyce would readily do it again, but I have the epicure-like feeling that I would prefer a novelty in help, that I would rather," and he looked at Richard and me, "develop generosity in a new soil and in a new form of flower." What do you think will be best, Miss Summerson? Said Richard, aside. I ventured to inquire generally before replying what would happen if the money were not produced. Jail, said the strange man, coolly putting his handkerchief into his hat, which was on the floor at his feet. Or Coavins's. May I ask, sir, what is Coavins's? Said the strange man. A house. Richard and I looked at one another again. It was a most singular thing that the arrest was our embarrassment, and not Mr. Skimpole's. He observed us with a genial interest, but there seemed, if I may venture on such a contradiction, nothing selfish in it. He had entirely washed his hands of the difficulty, and it had become ours.
I thought, he suggested, as if good-naturedly to help us out, that being parties in a chancery suit concerning, as people say, a large amount of property, Mr. Richard or his beautiful cousin, or both, could sign something or make over something to give some sort of undertaking or pledge or bond. I don't know what the business name of it may be, but I suppose there is some instrument within their power that would settle this.
Not a bit on it, said the strange man.
Really? Returned Mr. Skimpole. That seems odd now to one who is no judge of these things.
Odd or even, said the stranger gruffly. I tell you, not a bit on it.
Keep your temper, my good fellow, keep your temper.
Mr. Skimpole gently reasoned with him as he made a little drawing of his head with the flyleaf of a book.
Don't be ruffled by your occupation. We can separate you from your office. We can separate the individual from the pursuit. We are not so prejudiced as to suppose that in private life you are otherwise than a very estimable man with a great deal of poetry in your nature, of which you may not be conscious.
The stranger only answered with another violent snort. Whether in acceptance of the poetry tribute or in disdainful rejection of it, he did not express to me.
Now, my dear Miss Summerson, and my dear Mr. Richard,
said Mr. Skimpole gaily, innocently and confidingly, as he looked at his drawing with his head on one side.
Here you see me utterly incapable of helping myself, and entirely in your hands. I only ask to be free. The butterflies are free. Mankind will surely not deny to Harold Skimpole what it concedes to the butterflies.
My dear Miss Summerson, said Richard in a whisper, I have £10 that I received from Mr. Kenge. I must try what that will do. I possessed £15, odd shillings, which I'd saved from my quarterly allowance during several years. I'd always thought that some accident might happen in which would throw me suddenly without any relation or any property onto the world, and had always tried to keep some little money by me that I might not be quite penniless. I told Richard of my having this little store, and having no present need of it, and I asked him delicately to inform Mr. Skimpole, while I should be gone to fetch it, that we would have the pleasure of paying his debt. When I came back, Mr. Skimpole kissed my hand and seemed quite touched. Not on his own account. I was again aware of that perplexing and extraordinary contradiction, but on ours, as if personal considerations were impossible with him, and the contemplation of our happiness alone affected him. Richard, begging me for the greater grace of the transaction, as he said, to settle with Coavins's, as Mr. Skimpole now jocularly called him, I counted out the money and received the necessary acknowledgment. This, too, delighted Mr. Skimpole. His compliments were so delicately administered that I blushed less than I might have done, and settled with the stranger in the white coat without making any mistakes. He put the money in his pocket and shortly said, Well then, I wish you a good evening, miss.
My friend,
said Mr. Skimpole, standing with his back to the fire after giving up the sketch when it was half finished.
"I should like to ask you something without offence."
I think the reply was, "Cut away, then."
"Did you know this morning, now, that you were coming out on this errand?" said Mr. Skimpole.
"Knowed it yesterday afternoon at tea time," said Coavinses.
"It didn't affect your appetite? Didn't make you at all uneasy?"
"Not a bit," said Coavinses. "I knowed if you was missed today, you wouldn't be missed tomorrow. A day makes no such odds."
"But when you came down here," proceeded Mr. Skimpole, "it was a fine day. The sun was shining, the wind was blowing, the lights and shadows were passing across the fields."
"Nobody said they want in my hearing," returned Coavinses.
"No," observed Mr. Skimpole. "But what did you think upon the road?"
"What do you mean?" growled Coavinses with an appearance of strong resentment. "Think? I've got enough to do and little enough to get for it without thinking. Thinking!" with profound contempt.
"Then you didn't think, at all events," proceeded Mr. Skimpole, "to this effect. Harold Skimpole loves to see the sun shine, loves to hear the wind blow, loves to watch the changing lights and shadows, loves to hear the birds, those choristers in nature's great cathedral. And does it seem to me that I am about to deprive Harold Skimpole of his share in such possessions, which are his only birthright? You thought nothing to that effect."
"I certainly did not," said Coavinses, whose doggedness in utterly renouncing the idea was of that intense kind that he could only give adequate expression to it by putting a long interval between each word, and accompanying the last with a jerk that might have dislocated his neck.
"Very odd and very curious the mental process is in you men of business,"
said Mr. Skimpole thoughtfully.
"Thank you, my friend. Good night."
As our absence had been long enough already to seem strange downstairs, I returned at once, and found Ada sitting at work by the fireside talking to her cousin John. Mr. Skimpole presently appeared, and Richard shortly after him. I was sufficiently engaged, during the remainder of the evening, in taking my first lesson in backgammon from Mr. Jarndyce, who was very fond of the game, and from whom I wished, of course, to learn it as quickly as I could, in order that I might be of the very small use of being able to play when he had no better adversary. But I thought occasionally when Mr. Skimpole played some fragments of his own compositions, or when, both at the piano and the violoncello, at our table, he preserved, with an absence of all effort, his delightful spirits and his easy flow of conversation, that Richard and I seemed to retain the transferred impression of having been arrested since dinner, and that it was very curious altogether. It was late before we separated, for when Ada was going at 11 o'clock, Mr. Skimpole went to the piano and rattled hilariously that the best of all ways to lengthen our days was to steal a few hours from night, my dear. It was past 12 before he took his candle and his radiant face out of the room, and I think he might have kept us there if he'd seen fit until daybreak. Ada and Richard were lingering for a few moments by the fire, wondering whether Mrs. Jellyby had yet finished her dictation for the day, when Mr. Jarndyce, who'd been out of the room, returned. "Oh, dear me, what's this?" he said, rubbing his head and walking about with his good-humoured vexation. "What's this, they tell me? Rick, my boy, Esther, my dear, what have you been doing? Why did you do it? How could you do it? How much apiece was it? The wind's round again. I feel it all over me." We neither of us quite knew what to answer. Come, Rick, come, I must settle this before I sleep. How much are you out of pocket? You two made the money up, you know. Why did you? How could you? Oh, Lord. Yes, it's due east. Must be. Really, sir, said Richard, I don't think it would be honourable in me to tell you. Mr. Skimpole relied upon us. Bless you, my dear boy, he relies upon everybody, said Mr. Jarndyce, giving his head a great rub and stopping short. Sir, everybody, and he'll be in the same scrape again next week, said Mr. Jarndyce, walking again at a great pace, with a candle in his hand that had gone out. He's always in the same scrape. He was born in the same scrape. I verily believe that the announcement in the newspapers when his mother was confined was, on Tuesday last, at her residence in Botheration Buildings, Mrs. Skimpole of a son in difficulties. Richard laughed heartily, but added, Still, sir, I don't want to shake his confidence, or to break his confidence, and if I submit to your better knowledge again that I ought to keep his secret, I hope you will consider before you press me any more. Of course, if you do press me, sir, I shall know I am wrong and will tell you. Well, cried Mr. Jarndyce, stopping again and making several absent endeavours to put his candlestick in his pocket. Aye. Here, take it away, my dear. I don't know what I'm about with it. It's all the wind. Invariably has that effect. I won't press you, Rick. You may be right. But really, to get hold of you and Esther, and to squeeze you like a couple of tender young St. Michael's oranges, it'll blow a gale in the course of the night. He was now alternately putting his hands into his pockets as if he were going to keep them there a long time, and taking them out again and vehemently rubbing them all over his head. I ventured to take this opportunity of hinting that Mr. Skimpole, being in all such matters quite a child. My dear, said Mr. Jarndyce, catching at the word. Being quite a child, sir, said I, and so different from other people. You are right, said Mr. Jarndyce, brightening. Your woman's wit hits the mark. He is a child, an absolute child. I told you he was a child, you know, when I first mentioned him. Certainly, certainly, we said. And he is a child. Now, isn't he? Asked Mr. Jarndyce, brightening more and more. He was indeed, we said. When you come to think of it, it's the height of childishness in you, I mean me, said Mr. Jarndyce, to regard him for a moment as a man. You can't make him responsible. The idea of Harold Skimpole with designs or plans or knowledge of consequences. It was so delicious to see the clouds about his bright face clearing, and to see him so heartily pleased, and to know, as it was impossible not to know, that the source of his pleasure was the goodness which was tortured by condemning or mistrusting or secretly accusing anyone, that I saw the tears in Ada's eyes while she echoed his laugh, and felt them in my own. Why, what a cod's head and shoulders I am, said Mr. Jarndyce, to require reminding of it. The whole business shows the child from beginning to end. Nobody but a child would have thought of singling you two out for parties in the affair. Nobody but a child would have thought of your having the money. If it had been £1,000, it would have been just the same, said Mr. Jarndyce, with his whole face in a glow. We all confirmed it from our night's experience. To be sure, said Mr. Jarndyce. However, Rick, Esther, and you too, Ada, for I don't know that even your little purse is safe from his inexperience. I must have a promise all round that nothing of this sort shall ever be done any more. No advances, not even sixpences. We all promised faithfully, Richard with a merry glance at me, touching his pocket as if to remind me that there was no danger of our transgressing. As to Skimpole, said Mr. Jarndyce, a habitable doll's house with a good board and a few tin people to get into debt with and borrow money of would set the boy up in life. He's in a child's sleep by this time, I suppose. It's time I should take my craftier head to my more worldly pillow. Good night, my dears. God bless you. He peeped in again with a smiling face before we'd lighted our candles and said, Oh, I've been looking at the weathercock. I find it was a false alarm about the wind. It's in the south. And went away singing to himself. Ada and I agreed, as we talked together for a while upstairs, that this caprice about the wind was a fiction, and that he used the pretense to account for any disappointment he could not conceal, rather than he would blame the real cause of it, or disparage or depreciate anyone. We thought this very characteristic of his eccentric gentleness, and of the difference between him and those petulant people who make the weather and the winds, particularly that unlucky wind which he'd chosen for such a different purpose, the stalking horses of their splenetic and gloomy humours. Indeed, so much affection for him had been added in this one evening to my gratitude, that I hoped I already began to understand him through that mingled feeling. Any seeming inconsistencies in Mr. Skimpole, or even in Mrs. Jellyby, I could not expect to be able to reconcile, having so little experience or practical knowledge. Neither did I try, for my thoughts were busy when I was alone with Ada and Richard, and with the confidence I'd seemed to receive concerning them. My fancy, made a little wild by the wind perhaps, would not consent to be all unselfish either, though I would have persuaded it to be so if I could. It wandered back to my godmother's house, and came along the intervening track, raising up shadowy speculations which had sometimes trembled there in the dark, as to what knowledge Mr. Jarndyce had of my earliest history, even as to the possibility of his being my father, though that idle dream was quite gone now. It was all gone now, I remembered, getting up from the fire. It was not for me to muse over bygones, but to act with a cheerful spirit and a grateful. So I said to myself, Esther, 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 duty, my dear, and gave my little basket of housekeeping keys such a shake that they sounded like little bells and rang me hopefully to bed. And that is the end of chapter 6. And I will be back later with chapter 7. Chapter 7 is 9, 11. Oh, good. Chapter 7 is short, so I'll probably read that later today. I don't know when. I wish I could say, but I just can't. And thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.